Hi, Ed. Hey, Ricardo. We'll get going in a minute.
Thanks, Kenzie.
Good afternoon, both.
Hey, Ricardo.
Hey, Ed.
Hi, Counselor Campbell.
Hi, Counselor Brock. Thank you. Sorry, I'm behind.
No worries. It's a story of life. 1 minute. I'm just pulling up my opening statement and we will get going.
Sounds great.
All right. I'm going to call this working session of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee to order. For the record, my name is Kenzie Bach. I'm the District 8 City Councilor and also the chair of the Council's Ways and Means Committee. I'm joined here today by my colleagues, Councilor Campbell, who's co-sponsored this order with me, and Councilor Edwards, and also by Councilor Arroyo and Councilor Flynn. Thank you all, and Councilor Baker. Thank you all for being here. This working session is being recorded and live streamed. It's at boston.gov/city-council-tv and broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. The working session is on Docket 0329, which is order for a hearing regarding police contracts as policy documents. So a little bit of context for folks watching at home. This is a hearing order that we originally filed, Councilors Campbell and Edwards and I, last July, really focused on many of the issues that had come up in relation to our police budget and the operations of the police department, and the fact that a huge number of the issues that we were hearing about from the public and that kind of affect the sort of policy level of policing are actually importantly determined by our contracts with our various police officer unions. And so that puts the council in a strange position where, you know, we're big believers in collective bargaining and unionism in Boston, and collective bargaining agreements are reached at the table between the city administration and the unions, and the council's only role is to approve or disapprove those agreements at the end of the process. And yet important public policy decisions about the way that we keep our communities safe are being made de facto by those contracts. And those public policy questions are, you know, important ones for the council to wrestle with, and pretty key to thinking about what the future of good policing in our city looks like. And so filed this hearing order last July and had some hearing and working session on it, really looking at how, as a council, we can set clear expectations where, even though we're not at the bargaining table, the parties who are, so the city and the unions, understand that, you know, on some of the big picture issues around accountability for use of force, around fiscal responsibility, you know, sort of equity with our civilians, our civilian departments, that that those things are top of mind for the parties at the negotiation, so that we get the kind of reform-minded contracts that the council can support going forward. So I've really been trying to make sure that as a committee, the Ways and Means Committee, this is where all the contracts come, that we're really thinking about this and doing the work as a council to think about it and articulate some of those expectations prior to the next round of police contracts coming before us. And those contracts all expired back on June 30th of 2020. So we know that the city's in a process right now of negotiating a new round of those. And so I think this is the perfect time to be having this conversation. And now, of course, we find ourselves heading into another budget cycle. And I think it probably became even more relevant at our hearing last week or 2 weeks ago, where we learned that the department has significantly overrun the police overtime budget again. And I think the more we dig in on issues there, there's lots of external issues, all kinds of different things going on. But one of the big drivers, one of the big categories of drivers are the ways that our contracts are written and how they deal with overtime. And so it's just raised again the fact that this is an area with immediate public policy implications for the council. For every dollar we spend on something is a dollar we're not spending elsewhere. And this council actually took a strong position in 2016 that it was going to have more scrutiny on the fiscal responsibility of public safety contracts going forward. So I really see this as a fulfillment of that. This working session today is really more internal. We will be joined by Pam Coker from the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, but I had produced a memo that was kind of a summary of some of the conversation that we'd had last year. And in order for counselors to talk to each other about it and about things that each of us thinks are important when we think about the policy implications of the police contracts. And, I'm sure we have differing views represented in the body. For us to have that conversation, we have to have it in public. And so that's what a working session is, right? It's a chance for us to talk about those things with each other. And I'm hoping that we can move towards some consensus on those broad policy expectations that we can set for the folks who are at the table going forward. So that's sort of the context for the conversation today. This is not necessarily going to be a long working session. I want to make sure that I kind of give everybody who's here the floor. And after we go through counselors, we'll also go to Pam. And just kind of get things out on the table for further work on this front, because the contracts are really, I think about that metaphor of the iceberg and kind of 10% is above the water and 90% is under. When we think about policing in our city, how it's structured, how it works financially and in terms of accountability and discipline, really the contracts are the 90% that's under the surface. So we're trying to bring that out and have a public conversation about it. So that's sort of the opening frame. I'll add some remarks of my own later, but I want to go first, start with my council colleague, who is the chair of public safety and my co-sponsor on this agenda item, Councilor Andrea Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Bach. And of course, thank you as always for the partnership on these issues. It's great to see you. Long time no see. Obviously, we're just talking this morning about budget. So thank you for your continued leadership, your team as well, and for taking the lead on putting together that document, which is just incredible. And of course, we'll stay in contact on it. I also want, of course, thank Councilor Edwards for the partnership here. And I do think it's important to stress, and we stressed this at the very first hearing on this very topic, that we are absolutely in favor of labor laws and the spirit of negotiating and collective bargaining, et cetera. And that really this is designed to be able to not only share council priorities, but also that of the constituents we serve, and to allow for greater communication and partnership before we have to take action on these contracts in the future. And just yesterday, I in my office held a conversation with a whole host of advocates who have for years and will continue to push for policing reform, implementation, of course, of the reforms that this body and administration and task force committed to. But one of the things that came up was the contracts. And I think some of what you have captured in the document reflect their desires and concerns. And so I know when we get into it, that will come up. But what was important to folks is, one, this is timely. This is a very timely issue. We have to move with a sense of urgency on this as we come to a point where these negotiations will come to an end. So this is timely. This is an opportunity for us to lift up concerns we've heard over the years and to prioritize what the community wants to hear, not just with respect to, say, body cameras or overtime, universal body cameras or overtime regulations or minimums, disciplinary practices, of course, of our officers, training requirements, but also how we allow folks who are going to be in need of jobs coming out of COVID have access to unionized jobs via some of these details, which of course have to also be conducted or discussed in collaboration with the contract conversation. So I know residents are excited about this conversation. I will continue to bring their ideas forward. Much of that is reflected in the document already. So thank you to your team as well. And thank you, Councilor Bach, for your leadership. Look forward to continuing to work in partnership with you, other council colleagues, as well as folks in the community.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Campbell. I want to note that we've also been joined by Councilors Mejia and Braden. And I think I said Councilor Baker, but in case I didn't. So I think probably what makes sense is I'll run through council colleagues, and if there's anything that that you want to speak to in general on this topic, or if you want to drill in on specific things that were in the document that you think should be there, shouldn't be there, particular issues that you really want to have us focus on in the when we think about setting expectations on this front. Councilor Campbell just referred to the details issue. That's something which, although we often talk about the fact that police details are not exactly a budget issue because they're paid for by construction companies and utilities, they are a contract issue because the whole way that the detail system works is laid out in the police contract in a way that makes it challenging for us to think about, opportunities for good civilian jobs with some of those, including the tens of thousands of details that go unfilled in our current system. There's no mechanism for civilians to take those over right now. So that's it. Thank you, Councilor Campbell. I think that is an example of something that we could push on going forward. I'll go to, I've got my order here. I'll go to Councilor Arroyo and then Flynn and then Baker, Mejia, Braden. So Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you. And I'll be brief. I think the major aspect of this that we've seen, that people have seen, that has been a thing is the vast disparity between the pay increases and the salaries between officers and other city workers. We know that in 2019, 80 of the top 100 highest paid city employees were officers. That's 80% of the top 100. And that's not to say that, they're not doing good work, but those rates and those percentages and what we're looking at in terms of what's baked into these contracts is so different and so far apart from what other city employees are making who are also doing great work. And I would say on the detail front, just real briefly, I'm not 100% positive that isn't a taxpayer issue, in the sense that when Public Works is doing city work and we require details for that, I do believe that we've found that those costs get baked into the contracts that we essentially have to sign. It's not a de facto payment for a detail, but it's certainly a cost that when we do city public works projects and we require details, the contractors who are doing that bake those costs into what we pay them. And so that's just real. That's a taxpayer issue. We can, just because somebody else makes that payment on behalf of us, just because there's a middleman on that contractor front, doesn't mean that it's not city money or tax money paying for that ultimately. And so, on that front there, and then on the final aspect of this, I know that this is something that's going to come before the council at some point. I don't know if we have a timeline. It's obviously timely because we know it's coming, whether it's this year or in the following year, there will be something. And when we talk about the goals of ensuring transparency and accountability, a lot of those things get baked into how we do this contract and what comes out of this contract. And so I'm here mostly to listen. I know there's some folks on here that will have opinions that I'm very interested in hearing. And so with that, I'll hand it back to you, Madam Chair, but I don't have too many questions. I thought the document that we've all been shared on was relatively thorough. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Councillor Arroyo. Councillor Flynn?
Thank you, Councilor Bach, and to the sponsors for calling this hearing. It's an important discussion that we're having. So I'm looking forward to learning more about it, learning about the upcoming contracts as well. Just as a way of background, I know this body has always supported the rights of men and women to organize and to collective bargaining. I was on a picket line this morning with local 26 hotel workers. And we see, as a result of this pandemic, we see a lot of these workers being fired, unfortunately. It's outrageous in this city. But, you know, like you all, I'm a strong supporter of labor unions in the critical role they play in our city, fighting for their members, but also for their families as well, making sure that they have a decent wage, safe working conditions, dignity and retirement. So I think that part is important to focus on as well. I also want to focus on, as we talk about the contract, I want to learn more about, you know, what are some of the, you know, the police have been hit hard on this pandemic. A lot of police officers and their families have been impacted by this pandemic. Many police officers have had COVID-19, and I just want to see what the short-term public health issues are and the long-term public health concerns for them and their families, in making sure that as city employees, that they get the necessary medical care that they're entitled to, including time off as well. It's a stressful job, and we have to make sure that wellness programs are also part of this contract. And you know, I think it's important also to hear from the various police unions. I'm not sure if were we expecting to hear from the police unions on this, Councilor Bach?
So we're slightly awkwardly constrained, Councillor Flynn, because of the charter limitation against the council negotiating with sort of our public service unions. We're not generally advised to invite them to talk to us on a contract matter. So it is unfortunate. I agree with you.
Okay. Yeah. No. Thank you, Councilor Bach. That makes sense. And I just want to highlight one issue on details, on police details. I would like to know the number of arrests police officers have made on details. I think it's extremely high. And I think the Boston police have, you know, not only are they doing a detail, but they're providing exceptional public safety service to the residents of Boston on that detail. And I think those detail officers play a critical role, not only protecting the neighborhood, maybe on a construction site, but also being vigilant about their surroundings as well. So I would like to learn a little bit about some of the arrests that have taken place by detail officers. I think it's an important part of the discussion. And again, I just want to thank you, Councilor Bach, and I'm here to learn, I'm here to listen, and just want to highlight that the police officers are our neighbors. They're our Little League coaches. They're active in our community. They're concerned parents, but they also help build this city, built our country. They served in the U.S. Armed Forces, and they're Sunday school teachers. So just want to acknowledge them and their families, especially during these difficult times, and to let them know that we appreciate them in their work they do on behalf of the residents of Boston. Thank you, Councilor Buck.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Baker?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just would like some kind of clarification. We're looking to regard police contracts as policy documents. Does that mean that we want the city negotiators to take these principles of discussion as part of their main negotiating points? I'm actually kind of not clear on how you're moving this, because at the end of the day, the union doesn't, we're looking to do changes in the contract, they just say no to this all day long, and it goes to an arbitrator. And I know you're looking to try and take away the arbitrator's rights within this whole policy document. I just want some clarification on that. If you can break it down for me, Madam Chair.
Sure. So a couple of things. So, part of contract negotiations, as folks know, right, is that the administration brings proposals and the union brings proposals, and then they go back and forth. And I think that it's always true that the administration management side proposals, or I should say often true, that, they have to do with policy interests, right? So like things like, adding transparency with the wearing of body cameras, right? Or things like, the whole way that shifts are structured will allow management to do certain things with the way that it polices. So I think we should be honest about the fact that there's always policy implications in these conversations that happen at the bargaining table, right? And so the hope is by the council setting expectations around these issues, whether it's kind of, accountability for use of force and the way that our contract works in those cases, whether it's things like, keeping in mind the pay parity with civilian departments when they're negotiating what increases are. There's a host of things, right? That while we're not in the room, we want those policy concerns to be part of the sort of weather for the room. And so that's the objective here, is to acknowledge and bring out into the open those public policy implications of the proposals. Now, to your point about saying no and going to arbitration, I think it's important to note, and I'll break this down too for folks. So in Massachusetts, if a police or fire contract negotiation reaches impasse, right? So the parties just don't agree, which is what Councillor Baker's saying, okay, we put a bunch of reform things on the table, the parties don't agree. It goes to the Joint Labor Management Committee, JLMC, which is a special arbitrating board just for these public safety contracts. And then the JLMC looks at what, management's asking for and what the union's asking for, and it makes some determination. And that could be on all kinds of fronts, right? And then whatever the JLMC determines would come to us at the council. But the thing about that is that the council is still always the final say. And if the council votes it down, it has to go back to the bargaining table. In 2016, there was there was a result of one of these JLMC panels that resulted in very significant retroactive pay increases and a number of other things. And it came to the council, and the council was very concerned about the fiscal responsibility of approving that contract, because the share of the budget that it was taking was going to crowd out some other things. And so this council actually at that point unanimously signed a letter saying, okay, we're going to approve this one, but it can't go on like this. We can't have, we've had a couple of decades of the pay increments for our city workers who are civilians and our city workers who are sworn really diverge from each other. And, I don't think it's fair. And I think the council really expressed itself at that time saying, we can't take awards like this that are sort of done in isolation and don't consider the overall context of the city. So as far as I'm concerned, I was not here on the council at the time that letter was signed. A number of colleagues were. But I feel like as a body, we committed ourselves in that letter and we put everyone on notice, both on the administration side and on the union side, that, hey, we really expect these principles of fiscal responsibility and accountability to be baked into the negotiation up front next time. And we're not gonna be Lucy in the football with this one, right? And so I guess my view, Councillor Baker, is that, folks might dig their heels in and say, we're just going to go to the JLMC and think we can get what we want. But I think it's important for this council to be broadcasting consistently with the message of that letter, that like, we expect people to bargain in good faith, including around reform policy measures, and that the council isn't going to just kind of take what's sent our way if it doesn't reflect that kind of conversation. So that's certainly where I'm coming from as the chair.
Yeah,
I just
that's all.
wanted to add, Councilor Baker,
Can I have my time, please?
Yeah, let me go to Councillor Baker and then I'll go back to you, Councillor Campbell.
Yeah, well, I have this thought, please. That's all well and good when we're dealing with finances and strictly budgetary items here. I mean, we're talking something that, quite frankly, scares the death out of me is under principles of discussion, this civilian work, number 3. So we want to have civilians responding to 911 calls. I mean, that all sounds great until someone gets murdered on a traffic stop or someone gets murdered going into a domestic. Like, let's be realistic about this. And if that goes to the table, we're talking about 5 years we're negotiating with police. And you want to talk about an award at the end of that 5 years when we haven't been paying people, we're talking in the tens of millions. So I just think that we should tread lightly on this here. Maybe one piece here, 2 pieces here, but going after all this as a policy document, we will absolutely be bogged down in negotiation. So I think we have to be realistic about what it is we're looking for. I'm with you on the finances. I'm with you on, people making 300 grand. How much do they have to work to make that much money? I understand those things, but then we're going at a lot of other pieces here, which, quite frankly, I'm not sure I think we're going to bog the process down so it gets beyond the point we're ever able to complete a negotiating contract ever again. So those are my points, and you can go on with whoever else wants to speak. More points than anything else.
No, I appreciate that, Councillor Baker. And actually, I mean, one of the reasons why I want to have this conversation is precisely because this document it was really aimed to sum up a whole bunch of the things that came up in our conversations about this, right? Like, where are the key pieces where people want to make policy change and the contract is implicated? And so I think it's honestly helpful to hear which pieces different councillors feel like are kind of like should be at the center of the table and which are maybe separate efforts. But I think it's important to be honest about the fact that, for instance, like there's 2 different questions. There's the point you're making of whether we think civilian response to certain categories of 911 calls makes sense. And you and I might disagree about that. There's a separate thing where even if we agreed it was a good idea, we have to recognize that basically if there isn't a space in the contract for us to do that, we could end up with a labor challenge, right? And so to the extent that the city is going to pursue certain policy measures, it needs to make sure that it's aligning its contracts with the ability to do that, I would say.
And just for a little bit of background, I was the lead negotiator for my department for 10 years. So I've negotiated with the city. I've been in the middle of slow moving contract negotiations, and it was far less than this. I mean, 3 words you're stuck on for 3 months. I just think we have to be realistic.
Thank you. And Councillor Campbell, I know you were trying to get in.
No, thank you, Councillor Baker. I mean, obviously, when we were partnering on this, we talked offline, Councillor Bach, on how to approach it, et cetera. But one thing I wanted to lift up to Councillor Baker's point, when Commissioner Evans was still commissioner, and we were having conversations around body cameras and implementing body cameras, held a host of meetings in community around implementation of body cameras. And one of the points of frustration from the department and folks who participated in those meetings, it was folks from the department, advocates, of course, who've been pushing this for years, other counselors, was how do we get all that was discussed in those meetings into the negotiation process? And one way was sending a letter to Commissioner Evans that he could bring into the negotiations as a way to lift up some of the residents' ideas on what the policy governing body cameras could look like. And folks agreed it was a successful exercise. So I just wanted to lift up that specific example as something that was positive, that was able to be incorporated in that negotiation process. And hopefully this same exercise will be able to do the same. Also recognizing, of course, Councilor Baker's points as well. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Councilor Campbell. Going next to Councilor Mejia, then Councilor Braden, and we've also been joined by Councilor Sabi George. Councilor Mejia?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the chair for calling this working session. There are a lot of different angles that we can view this conversation from. As the chair of committee on workforce development, it's important to acknowledge workers' rights, particularly around the construction detail. We have an opportunity to reimagine how our civilian workforce is utilized. We also see this as a fundamental civil rights issue. We need to see changes in our public safety infrastructure overall to ensure that everyone in our city is able to feel safe and to thrive. And I think that there's a lot here to unpack. And I think, I'm not sure if, because I was late to the party, but it seemed like Councilor Baker already asked some questions. So could I ask, I mean, like, I don't want to like speak out of turn, but I am curious to know, you know, I think it's a good idea to move away from thinking of overtime as a routine aspect of police work. And I'm wondering if just saying that overtime should be for unpredictable aspects, right, of police work. And we're leaving too much wiggle room, I think, that will send into overtime abuse, which is what we're already seeing. And so I'm just wondering how we could be more, how can we more specifically define unpredictable aspects of police work? I think that would be great to get some clarity around that. And I do have some questions surrounding the language of the memo, so we can unpack it a little bit further. And, you know, I don't want to go too much into the weeds here, but there's some things in the memo that the council has taken action on previously. Councilor Edwards, Wu, and myself filed an ordinance around the alternative to 911 response system. So I'm just kind of curious about how all of these things can, how all of these things are interacting. But I think that you just asked us for opening remarks. I'm going to pump my brakes and allow you to go with the process, because I don't want to have you answer all these questions. So I'm just going to.
Thanks, Councilor Mejia. I mean, it's fine to put those questions out on the table now. We're trying to have a working session. So, but I'll run through everybody and then we can come back to more of them. I think the thing I would say about that last point you raised, the 911 response, is exactly the point of this, is to say, what are the policy actions that the council would like to take that might require some change in the contract to be effective? So it's designed, the two pieces are designed to go together. It's not duplicative, it's like complementary. So for instance, to make sure that we can have, I mean, this just came up with Councilor Baker, right? But like if you want to have an unarmed civilian response to some 911 calls, well, currently the whole way that we run dispatch is laid out in our police contract. So if you want part of dispatch to send calls somewhere else and not send them to police officers, you may need to negotiate that, like, for it to be effective. So that's something where we could pass an ordinance, but if it's not negotiated in the contract, it's not actually having a grip. You know, that's, and we've seen that, you know, we need to talk at the table about things like universal body cameras and having them on in overtime, right? So, and when we've talked about the idea of civilianizing some of the details, that's something that, because of the way the details system is described in the contract, probably also needs addressing there. So that's the idea. It's not that this is another way of doing those things. It's that this is a necessary piece of doing some of those things. And I think often it's, yeah, like I said, it's kind of the iceberg under the surface. Like, it's hard for people to see the way the contract is going to constrain us in some of these policy moves. So that's the idea.
Thank you.
but I will circle back for more specific questions because we definitely want to get them out. I think next up is Councillor Braden, then Councillor Asabi George, and then we've been joined by Councillor Edwards, who's also a co-sponsor of this. Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm reviewing the memo once again, and I think one of the issues that I raised the other day was the issue around if long-term sick leave, people are out on injured duty list for a long time. In terms of actually having a predictable structure that folks know what the procedures are and the timeline and what triggers an action in terms of reviewing someone's ability to do the job. And I know this is very much ingrained in the whole contract negotiations. I don't want in any way to take away the fact that if an officer has served for a very long time, that they deserve a proper procedure and proper consideration of if they're at the stage where they need to be reassigned to different duties within the force, or if they would be considered for retirement. I think that with the increasing numbers of officers that are concerned, it is a big issue. And as a person who comes from a rehabilitation background, I really recognize that sometimes injuries take a while to recover from, and we want to have a system that recognizes that, but also a system that is fair to all parties. The other question that came up from our discussions within my team were, looking from a labor relations perspective, wondering about using an interest-based listening bargaining approach rather than a proposal and counter proposal to negotiations, so that you could maybe come to common ground rather than sort of a bidding war back and forward with I'll up you, a tough counter proposal type of negotiation, whether more of an interest-based listening bargaining approach would be a different way to go at this. And those are really the two comments that I had. And I look forward to learning more. There's a lot of material here, and I really look forward to the conversation and really digging in on this in this working session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Braden. Councillor Asabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I came in a few minutes late, so I hope that some of my questions or my, just earlier initial comments about the document isn't repetitive. But one of the sort of the concerns or the lenses in which we're looking at this, and it's through your principles, is that financial responsibility piece. So I wonder, where are the opportunities for true cost savings? Because as we know, and as we discussed in last week's hearing regarding overtime, is when we add additional personnel, there is an added cost when we think about health insurance and other benefits. So identifying where sort of that sweet spot is, I think is really important to understand, and making sure that we are at an appropriately sized force, that we are doing an appropriate level of hiring to get to that sort of critical mass. And then also, when we think about the injury list, really, it seems that we've spent some time discussing that, and there's some room to improve that number, and that will certainly help to right size the sworn personnel. The other thing, a question of mine or a point of concern or interest, I suppose I should say, is the on the civilian flaggers, the consideration around the state law for the hourly rate and the wage, and whether or not there are any savings there. That came up last week as well. And then lastly, for me, at least right now, is some of the administrative roles. And I think that there's, sort of general consensus that there's a desire to make sure that civilians are doing a lot of those administrative roles, but those administrative roles are also places where police officers who are on light duty find themselves. And I would say, I worry about it maybe disproportionately impacting female police officers who are either coming back from a maternity leave or preparing for a maternity leave, who may be on light duty, and I'm curious about the unintended consequences of some of that shift on the female workforce within BPD. So those would be my initial thoughts about, what we're looking at today, and, looking forward to the rest of today's conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Sabi George. I was going to say something, but I forgot. So Councillor Edwards.
Very much. I'm excited about this conversation. And I think it's really just kudos to the body in general that we have decided that this is something that we're going to stick with and probably have perpetually conversations about this. For those who are watching, I hope you understand this is actual police reform. We are doing it. Well, we're looking at the contracts and we're looking at all aspects of how to reform and look at policing. This is part of that conversation. So I'm just want to say thank you to all my colleagues for being on here. Thank you in general for being committed to this. It's incumbent upon us to look at this through this lens, because without looking at the contract, all of the ordinances, as Councillor Bach mentioned, everything that she talked about, all the good ideas, all the moments will be for naught, because we're going to come slamming up against basic contract law. If the city signs a contract that does X, the city will have to commit to those things. So how we reform those contracts, and again, putting it on many of the folks who are in BPD is also incumbent. They need to be partners in this. We're hoping that the point of the open conversation is that they are part of also doing a lot of the reforms that they want and know are necessary. So this is not anti, this is actually very pro creating a modern, efficient, fiscally responsible police force for the city of Boston. So that's all I'll say for now as my opening remarks. If we're going to go through a bunch of questions, I can do that in the second round. But I just wanted to make sure people understood this is what reform looks like. It's not sexy. It's not necessarily on Twitter. It's not necessarily through hashtags. It's actually through these long conversations that look at contracts and numbers and pull out the calculators and really look and help to design. So I wanted to just acknowledge that work that's being done.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Edwards. Yeah, I think probably what makes the most sense now might be to kind of run through each of the kind of big picture topic areas. And then when folks have further comments and questions about that, we can kind of go to them. I can take people's hands and such, just so that we have a joined up conversation. So the first thing is this expectation around reaching pay terms that are in parity with the civilian workforce. So I talked a bit about this. Sorry, I should have said it was a 2013 JLMC decision, but it ran for 6 years through 2016. That really, it ended up giving our police a 25% raise over 6 years, while our civilian workforce only saw a 12% raise. And because of the way those things compound, we're seeing this divergence. And so the council, like I said, did write a unanimous letter in 2016 saying that it couldn't approve further arbitration awards that exacerbate that dynamic. I think that when we think about that issue, it's partly the literal pay numbers, but it's also the fact that there's a bunch of categories. So there's hazard pay, there's overtime, which, as Councillor Mejia mentioned, was being treated as is sort of functionally a routine measure in our police department. And as we've recently, been reminded again, can run over because of the Corporations Council's interpretation of a 1982 law that says, well, as long as sort of the police department okays it, it kind of counts as this emergency spending. And so because overtime is of course based on base pay, when you have those differentials, they then get magnified. And on the sick and injury front, I just really want to underscore for folks at home and also for colleagues, because I think like we're talking about the sick and injured piece, but we're maybe not fully wrapping our arms around it. Like like the sick and injured numbers have gone up 71% in the last 2 years. They were flat and they've almost doubled. And that's pre-COVID. And no one from the department has been able to explain to us like why, in the sense of what changed. And it's causing us to replace 100 officers. And that alone is, I mean, if you do a back of the envelope, it's probably cost us about $17.5 million this year. Probably the entire overrun that we're talking about from our budget this year is based on this extraordinary replacement cost. And if we go back to normal police procedures and we continue to have that balloon next year, our police overtime budget without something changing is going to go to 80 more, like 80 million more. I don't know. But like, so, you know, I think that's why it's important to stress thinking about when the department says, well, we don't know how long it will take to bring that list down and whatever, thinking about what are the contract procedures that are causing us to be hung up for multiple years on that list, because it's a totally fiscally unsustainable thing. And yeah, so I just wanted to underscore a couple of points on that. I think just staying for a minute in this space of the fiscal controls piece, were there other things that people wanted to raise comments or questions about you didn't bring up in your opening remarks on this kind of topic one? If you raise your blue or physical hand.
Topic one being specifically around the civilian.
No, topic one being around the whole fiscal responsibility kind of space. So the 4 topics are fiscal responsibility and fairness to all city workers, then like accountability for use of force, then civilianization, and then I think we had a transparency one. That was just buckets I was trying to organize things into, but.
Well, I noticed that Pam Coker's on, and I was curious, honestly, what the Research Municipal Bureau finds to be a fiscally responsible budget or BPD. Have they defined it? Have they looked at it? Is the current trends that you have just mentioned of increasing over and over per year, is that fiscally responsible? Do they have any opinion about that?
Yeah, I definitely Pam's on the line, and I'll Pam, if you're ready, I'd love to take your testimony in a second. Are you prepared? I know I said I go to you more towards the end. All right, I might just give Pam a minute. I see that Councillor Flynn has his hand up.
Thank you.
Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Council Block. I wanted to, as it relates to a fiscal issue, I know the overtime budget is certainly something we're focused on, but is the subject of the city council and the mayor's office consistently hiring new police officers, putting on a new class consistently every year factored in? Are we factoring in the retirements, I should say, of police officers that take place every year? But we don't keep up with that in terms of the number of police officers that we hire. I think we have to be consistent in making sure that we have classes on every year that meets the demand of the police department. And that's a critical part of this conversation. As I said before, we need to hire more additional police officers. We don't have enough police officers in the city of Boston. We have police officers that are retiring every week, and we're not substituting them in with new classes. So my question is, are we going to be proactive in determining how many police officers we need every year due to ongoing retirements? And if so, what is that number? How much will it cost? But also, we need to be prepared that we need to put on several hundred police officers each year, factoring in retirements. Just wanted to see what your thoughts might be, or the thoughts of my colleagues as well. Thank you, Councilor Buck.
Thank you, Counselor Flynn. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I think that the real thing is that there's a world in which, you know, more frequent cadet classes could save us money, but it would have to be a world in which you were also expediting expediting retirement and such, right? You could model it out. People do that all the time. Like, you could figure out what the net cost to us is, and it might be that as a long-term strategy it could work. I don't know the fiscal answer, but I think it's fair to raise that today. So thank you. And I'll see if other councilors have comments on that. Councilor Asabi George.
I do have one. You know, I know we've spent a lot of time thinking about the financial impact of the almost 300 police officers out injured. And I know that, you know, we've discussed that it's not necessarily directly related to COVID. We think about some of the COVID related stuff, but I do know the process of returning to work requires certain medical clearances and processes, and that has been delayed because of COVID, access to medical professionals. So I wonder if we could ever correlate some of the injuries that went out pre-COVID were further delayed because of COVID. The other consideration I would say is, you know, we've got a number of police officers who are attempting to retire that have significant injuries, but because of COVID, there's been, or partially because of COVID, and then the state review system, the medical review system, that takes a long time to process. So I wonder if that plays a role in it. And then I'd also be curious in any analysis around the age of the workforce. And, you know, we do have a growing number of females who are officers. And is there any correlation to out injured or out sick as it relates to maternity leave, for example? You know, so I think that those are very interesting dynamics to look at and to better understand. And, you know, and maybe Pam could speak to this. I'm not sure if it's part of her analysis at all, but that, you know, the medical piece and getting people back to work is one that I know is a pinch point in the process as well. And I think COVID has certainly exacerbated that.
Great. Thank you, Councilor Asabi George. And yes, I see Pam is with us. So I'm gonna let, since we're on the overarching topic of fiscal responsibility, I'm gonna let the Boston Municipal Research Bureau weigh in.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Pam Coker. I'm the president of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau. I'm also a city resident, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this working session. As you know, the organization is very much focused on sound city finances and policy. So the Boston has the resources to do what it needs to do and wants to do now and in the future for all who live, work, and learn in our city. Certainly, council review and approval or rejection of collective bargaining agreements for arbitration decisions is key to the city's fiscal well-being and the well-being of its residents. And in particular, as we're going to talk about we're starting to talk about the expensive contracts and concerns there. We did testify back in September at a hearing on some of these same issues. With some real concern about the escalation of arbitration awards when that process was used to settle a contract, and that the costs were perhaps getting somewhat out of control when it comes to, in particular, public safety contracts. And for example, we've seen some situations such as the increase in costs, particular to Boston Police Department payroll. Payroll has increased 43%, or over $125 million between 2011 and 2019. And again, I'm using that time frame with the 2019 because this was testimony from the fall of 2020. So dramatically exceeding personnel costs in all other departments. And one of the things we have continued to be focused on when we look at the contracts is the contract provisions that drive increases, and whether they're agreed on at the bargaining table or if they end up at the state level joint labor management committee And that is a place where we have seen a history of arbitration awards going very much in favor of the police unions, public safety unions, I should say. So some of this is concern about cost, and some of it is the mechanisms that are applied to end a negotiation process that has not been successfully completed in any other way. So that is one way where we see these increased costs for the city as an outcome of some of these difficult negotiations. Another thing that we always look for in contracts is the so-called hidden costs. Additions to pay for this purpose or that purpose, for using this piece of equipment, or wearing this type of device these days. It could certainly seem to be the body cameras. So those additional costs that come with additional adjustments to how policing is done, or when it's done, or by whom, and for how long. And so those issues contribute to increased costs, as well as in some cases have an impact on the overtime dynamic. So those are some of the kinds of things that we had been looking at most recently. Others examples are hazardous duty compensation, the police career incentive program, vacation buybacks, which are pension eligible and add to an employee's retirement allowance. So those are some of the things when we dig into a contract that we look at. But of course, those are sort of the next level of things after the simple base pay. But again, our biggest concern has been the arbitration awards over the years, done at the state level, and done primarily very much in favor of the unions, and therefore makes them very challenging for the city to be able to afford. When it comes to looking at affordability, I mean, one of the things we look at is not just if it's a multi-year contract, not just what it does for the next year, but what it does for the years after that, and the accumulation effect of raises and those other hidden costs that I had mentioned. So we try to look at a contract as a whole and over its multiple years, and what the impact will be towards the end of that contract. Not sure if this information is in any way helpful. I'm happy to take any particular questions that might help focus us to make sure I'm getting to something that's useful for you, or I'm happy to take a question if I can't answer it right now, bring the information back to you all.
Sorry, I was muted. Great. Thank you so much, Pam. It would be great if you could stick around a little bit for counselor questions and conversation.
Yes.
I've got two colleagues with hands up, so I'm going to go to them, and I don't know if they have a question for you. They might just have a comment on this topic, but then I'll also see if there are any colleagues with questions for you. So I think Counselor Edwards will have one. So Counselor Arroyo, and then Counselor Mejia. Counselor Arroyo.
Yeah, thank you. I had my hand up prior to Pam's presentation. And so I just wanted to touch on the concept or theory that we have to be hiring hundreds of new officers. I just want to know where and how we're making these sorts of analyses, because I don't know what we're tying that to. Are we tying that to the crime rate? Because the crime rate is down. It's been going down. Are we tying that to the population size? Because I'm not sure data shows that a higher population for some reason leads to an increased need for policing or for officers. I know I've been trying really hard to figure out how we're setting up our staffing, how we're setting up our staffing levels, how many officers we have at the district level, as to how, which in other words, for folks listening who don't know what I mean, the officers who patrol these specific districts, your local police officers, and how many officers we have that are sort of in these citywide units that are taken away from the district level because they're doing specialized things. And so I don't have any of those numbers. I would love to have those numbers before we start just saying that we need hundreds and hundreds of new officers, and we're not really tying it to crime data or a rise in crime or a rise in any necessitated need or any understanding of what the borderline staffing is. And so, I know we see overtime is increasing. So obviously I can see that, and we can try to make the justification that that is because we don't have enough officers. But I don't know that we know what the number of officers would be to put that in line, for instance. I don't know that we know how many additional officers it would take to, say, eliminate that sort of forced overtime spending that we're talking about, because we don't have those baseline numbers. And so, you know, just as in terms of that conversation, I'm certainly not saying that we don't necessarily need more additional officers. I just don't know how we would even come close to ballparking what that would be, or what analysis we're using to come up with that number. And I'm happy to hear if folks know what we should be tying that to, or what they believe we should be tying that to, or traditionally what that's been tied to. But I don't actually know what we're using on that, because I know that the crime rate, even this year, has gone down. The year previous to this has gone down. We've seen an increase this year on homicides, but everything else is down. Last year, we had a similar successful year. I believe the year before that as well. The population's risen for all of those years. We've had the same number of officers. And so I think we do have to start looking at sort of those issues. And then from a cost saving perspective, I really appreciate Councilor Asabi George listing up that there might be a gender equity disparity when we talk about civilianization of those roles. I think that's actually really important and something we have to look at. But I do think at some level, we have to look at civilianizing administrative tasks within the BPD. And I think we would see real cost savings for doing that. And so I just wanted to add those things.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Mejia?
Yes, thank you, Councilor Bach. So, you know, for those folks who are tuning in, you know, I think it's important. The way I'm experiencing this conversation, I think about my credit card, right? And if I go over my limit on my debit, the bank charges me $35 or so. So I try really hard to never do any overdrafting, right? And so I'm just curious, Councilor Bach, as you continue to look at this conversation, what measures can we put in place in terms from an accountability perspective, so that if you do go overtime, there is a penalty fee that comes along with it? I know that keeps me and my accounting right in check. When I know that I'm going to get a $35 overdraft protection, I work really hard at making sure that I don't bounce any of my checks. And so I'm just curious, as we're having this conversation, what levers of accountability do we have to stay within the allotted budget so that we're not having this conversation?
Is that a question for me, or just putting it out there?
Well, I don't know if anyone could answer that, but I'm just curious. If anyone could answer it, it's you, the Ways and Means Chair. No, I'm just curious, like, as we talk about these documents, as you know, this is policy documents and all this other good stuff, you know, we're talking about overtime, and I just feel like they already went over. We already had this discussion last year, and they already went over the budget that we said that they couldn't go over. And now here we are talking about how do we prevent this? So I'm just curious, are there any mechanisms in place through the council and through the work that we're doing here to put some accountability measures that say, well, if you do go overtime, then you'll be penalized in X kind of way, just to keep the checks and balances in order?
Yeah. So I think on that, I have a couple of thoughts. One is certainly, I think that the city has taken a fairly open interpretation of this 1982 law that sort of allows them to run over on an emergency basis, and has kind of used it to mean run over however much the department decides. And I think that an administration could take a much narrower interpretation, really only save that for emergencies, and assign less overtime. I think it's important to remember, right? We're always going to pay people for the hours that they work, right? That's a basic tenet. We all believe in that. So it's a question of, like, what are the assignments, right, that are going out, and where, and what's the hours that we're allowing people to claim, right? But, like, you know, once people do the work, then of course we're paying them for it. So I think, you know, there's a management control perspective. Like the person with a credit card, at some point in your analogy, it's the police commissioner and the command staff, right? It's who are they assigning, and how are they thinking about how we allocate our resources? And to Councilor Arroyo's point, what we have a very hard time as a council. We've repeatedly asked for minimum staffing standards to understand, how they're allocating those resources, and we haven't gotten that information. I think that, demanding that information, but also ultimately, I think the check is holding the commissioner and the command staff responsible for achieving savings and figuring out how to do good policing and keep our city safe within the confines of the public safety budget that we can responsibly afford, right? And then the penalty on that side is, is that's what your job performance is being measured on at some point. So I think that's those are accountability measures that aren't about changing the contract. I think where you change the contract is certain things. When we've all talked about the fact that court overtime, you're much more likely for us to be paying for unworked hours. I know there's been some interest from the council. I think Councillor Campbell and Roy, others have suggested, that that's a specific provision we should look at. And then I think this interpretation of just running over could be looked at again. So those are some thoughts from me, but I'd welcome other people's as well. I'm going to go to Councillor Edwards. I think had a question, possibly for a comment or a question maybe for Pam Coker. No. Okay, never mind. She's all set. Pam, I wanted to go back to you if you wanted to say something else.
Sure. Yeah. What I had in mind to share initially in my remarks this afternoon is just to recognize the work that was done in this memo and the work that you all have done to date on these issues. I'm really, really excited to see this conversation that you're giving to both a set of policy principles to uphold in council review of the city's upcoming round of contracts, and to how the city might actually operationalize those principles. On fiscal responsibility and fairness to all city workers, on civilization of civilian work, and increased transparency of police department work through public data sharing. I just think this is such an opportunity to focus the conversation and discuss specific strategies and what is required to get them implemented, or adjustments before implementing them. It just seems like this effort that you all are engaged in right now is just such a great point at which I feel like this conversation is really starting to move forward. And so I'm just really excited about the work that you're doing now and the potential that it can have to really, when you all really are digging into this, to have a real impact, and also know where the spots are that it may be difficult to make an impact because of the way that some of these contracts are, and the challenge of getting some of them changed. But just really excited about this effort.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the kind words. I think there's lots of work to do, but we're trying to pull all the threads together here. And again, recognize that we have an important policy making role and that there are important policy implications here. Councillor Braden, I see you've got your hand raised.
I was wondering if Pam could help me understand some more about the hidden costs. She mentioned a few. I just wondered what proportion of the pay packet that an officer gets is tied to hidden costs that you don't necessarily, that are in additional to their base pay.
Mm-hmm. That is a really good question, and I don't have a numerical answer for you for that right now. It does really depend on the officer and what types of bonuses or support that they are eligible for, based on, in some cases, additional training, or training for use of specific weapons, or training in terms of additional schooling. It may also relate to certain additions around education, such as the Quinn Bill. So that's something that we try to look for when we go into a contract and look at the details. And I'd be happy to send you a list of some of the kinds of things that we tend to look for and see that are in some cases contributing significantly to the overall cost of funding the officers.
Thank you. Because I think sometimes we end up seeing the gross pay at the end of all
Yes.
the additions, and we don't get a good insight into
Look at the breakout. Yes.
what the breakout is and what the pay, what the base pay looks like.
Yes.
Which in many cases may be driving the need for officers to seek extra overtime to compensate. So I really look forward to getting a better handle on all of this. Thank you.
Terrific.
Councillor Sabi George.
Thanks again. I'd love if Pam, if you would share that with everybody, that'd be great, or through the
Sure.
chair, and she can share it with all of us. That would be interesting to look at. Something that I think has come up over many hearings and sort of over the years, at least in my recollection, around potential savings and looking for sort of tightening of the belt a little bit, is a shift in how we do the shifts. And so the 10-hour shift has come up a number of times. I'm not sure if, Madam Chair, if we've looked at that at all to understand truly what the impact of that could be around financial savings. I see Pam nodding her head, so I'm curious if that's, how that's been considered and how that might impact this budget or any budget.
Mm-hmm. I don't have anything for you immediately on this, unfortunately. Can we see if we've got something that could be more useful and share it with you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, that'd be very helpful. I feel that we've talked about it in past hearings.
Yeah.
In sessions similar to this as a cost saving measure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, and I don't think Councillor Sabi George, to your point, that we've really, I think it's been a suggestion raised a number of times. I know that Councillor O'Malley's raised it as well.
Yeah.
I think I haven't seen a like actual kind of cost projection of what it could save, but I think it would be an interesting line to pursue further. So, yeah.
And I would note, I know the Quinn bill came up. I think having an educated force is a good thing. I do, sort of wonder about, I know the details and specifics around the Quinn bill and that it's, certain schools and a certain degree, but just in general, I think that an educated workforce is a better workforce. As a teacher, I'm required to have a master's degree. I'm required to have it in a particular field, and there's additional certification, all that. But my understanding is once I get that particular piece of paper, I can continue my education in any field, and those credits count towards, lane and step bumps. And, so because I think there's a general recognition of a more educated force as a more productive force and sort of a, more in tune force. That's it. I mean, that's, I guess, more of a comment than anything else. Thank you. I am curious though, if there is any research done around the 10-hour piece, and I'll also consult with Councillor O'Malley on that.
Great. Thanks so much, Councillor Sabi George. Councillor Mejia, do you still have your hand up? I'm not sure if it's.
No, I'm sorry. I should take my hand down. I'll wait for the next round of questions.
All right. Awesome. Yeah, so maybe then in terms of sort of the next topic area, and it's shorter in the memo, but I think it's pretty important, accountability for use of force and abuse of power. So there's just one thing under this, but which suggests sort of removing binding arbitration for major discipline and enabling new accountability measures to operate effectively. So for folks' reference, so there's an article in the contract entitled Grievance and Appeal, which is the mechanism that drives almost all labor management disputes in the police department to binding arbitration. And I think arbitrators have overturned about 3/4 of BPD discipline and nearly 1/3 of firings in the past 13 years. I think it's important to know it hasn't always been this way. The 1979 police contract, it actually exempted decisions regarding suspension and discharge from binding arbitration. So the basic idea, right, is that binding arbitration, ultimately something goes to an arbitrator, they make a call and it's binding, right? The hint's in the name, and then that's what it is. And I think that, older versions of our contract, and I spent some time in the city archives related to this, made the distinction of, hey, at a moment when, if you get to a point where the, commissioner is doing serious suspension or discharge, that should maybe be a kind of level of decision that doesn't get second guessed by an arbitrator. And so it's in a different category. But by the 07 contract, that distinction had disappeared. And now, although in theory, there's still a discipline and discharge section where you can use civil service, like functionally, basically all such issues run through grievance and appeal. And I think what's tough about that is that it's meant that a lot of the department's most well-known sort of like abuse of force cases over the last few decades have gone to binding arbitration and gotten overturned. And I think that from a police accountability perspective, that's a real stumbling block for us. And I think, it's something that I think I've certainly heard from lots of officers, that when you have somebody who really, mistreats the use of force, like that's a problem for all the other officers, and that, that's not a type of behavior that you want to encourage or that good police officers want to see happen. But the reality is, the way our contract is set up, it has frustrated multiple police commissioners over the last 20 years in being able to actually terminate somebody who really crosses the line. And my particular concern about this in the moment, and I'm glad see Councillor Campbell again on the screen, is that we, as everyone knows, the council has just partnered with the mayor to pass a major new civilian review board. And that has the possibility of having some real accountability around use of force, except that without a change in the contract, what the civilian review board is recommending has the potential of being overturned through exactly the same mechanism as what the police commissioner has been recommending. So people might think a civilian review board is going to do a better job than a police commissioner, and folks can go back and forth, and that's a whole conversation. But even regardless of that, the point is that the way our contract's currently written, whether it is the police commissioner or the civilian review board recommending that someone be suspended or terminated, our current contract makes it quite possible for a binding arbitration decision to overturn that. And I think that's a problem in terms of efficacy. So I don't know if other folks have comments on that front.
I'll just chime in. I absolutely agree with you, Councillor Bach, and I appreciate you giving this full context to just a lay citizen, right, and resident who cares about policing reform, but recognizes, even as we are pushing for the implementation of OPAT and these other measures, we have to continue the conversation on the contracting side to be able to ensure that that body and those individuals that ultimately compose the civilian review board in the IOT is that they are given all the power that we can give them in order to actually hold the department accountable if something goes wrong, be independent from the department as well. So I fully support these pieces here. And I'm back. I apologize. There was obviously that car accident outside my house. Thank God everyone's okay, but thank you for continuing the conversation. But I agree with you. This part is just as important.
Glad to have you back, and glad everyone's okay. Do we have other councillor comments on this, the sort of use of force accountability question? I mean, like I said, it's just one provision in this thing, so we can definitely move on to the next one. All right, why don't we move on to the next one? I'm just mindful of time. So the next topic is the civilianization of civilian work. And, in their, I just want to flag, in their July presentation to us, the BPD made reference to a long-term goal of civilianizing 80 to 100 administrative positions currently filled by sworn officers. And again, those officers are paid at regular and hazard pay rates that are commensurate with their training for police work. And I think in general, it makes sense given the pay differentials that are there because of the training that our sworn officers have. It makes sense to have them doing police work. And of course, 80 to 100 is a lot of people. Within those administrative positions, 32 of them are folks who are involved in operating a highly decentralized detail system, which has been mentioned for reform since at least the 93 contract, and which actually currently costs the department more than the 10% administrative fee we receive. So to unpack that, we were talking earlier about the fact that the details in theory don't cost the city because outside forces are paying for them. Councilor Arroyo made the good point that sometimes it's the outside entity paying for them is actually one of our public city agencies, like BTD or someone doing work. The other wrinkle in the detail system is that, so in the contract where we specify all of these administrative positions that operate the detail system, that again are being filled by sworn officers. And when you sort of add that whole apparatus up, and when I say decentralized, what I mean is that instead of there being like a central system that's booking the details, they're getting parceled out and booked through all the different district offices. And there's a whole hierarchy and order to how they get spread around. And so it's not, I would say, the most efficient system for doing that. And it's employing 32 folks in a sort of desk job capacity. And when you add that all up, it's more than the bonus that the city gets on those detail hours from the contractors who have to pay for them. So I think net, we are actually paying for the detail system. But I think, so there's the detail piece, there's this general administrative jobs piece. I take Councilor Sabi-George's point, and it's a good one for further conversation. The question of sort of like, who are these providing a good outlet for folks to cycle through when they're on light duty? Is it enabling our police officers who might have been out on maternity leave and just coming back or something? I think digging into that more makes good sense. And then the other two bullets on civilianization that are in this document are related to this idea of opening up construction detail opportunities to local civilian workforces, especially, the construction details and the large number, as we've learned, of unclaimed construction details. We had about 26,000 that were unclaimed in the sort of 10 months prior to last November when we got numbers then, and another large number unclaimed in the last few months. So, we've talked about the fact that those are good jobs that I think Councilor Sabi-George raised. So basically, because of the way that the prevailing wage law works around details, civilians would be paid pretty much close to the police wage. And so it means they'd be very well-paying jobs. But there might be a real opportunity to get a bunch of, local Boston folks into the workforce, trained in OSHA regs. I think that's something that we've heard a lot of interest from in the community. And that we could probably start with assigning some portion of the ones that are not currently claimed by the police department to a force like that. And then this last civilianization point was the point that we've discussed a little bit already about the 911 alternative response, and the fact that to do that, you might need contract change. You might not need contract change for all aspects of it, but you might at least for the dispatch issue. So those are some of the civilianization things that are raised in the memo. I don't know if anyone has further comments. There have definitely been a bunch of comments already on these, but just any further comments on civilianization? All right.
No, I'm going to talk. Be quiet. Hello.
Councilor Mejia? Yeah.
I do have a question about, the civilian, just creating employment opportunities for a lot of our civilians. There are a lot of folks who are underemployed at this moment, right? And if we can look at this conversation through what is the greater good for all of Bostonians, is there a way for us to kind of lean in from that perspective and looking at the unemployment rates? Is there an opportunity for us to also look at creating opportunities? I know this is probably going to sound like earthy, crunchy granola, but like having a community response to helping to deal with some of the issues that are happening in our community. I know that we have the the mental health and wellness ordinance, the alternative to 911 that Councilor Wu and Councilor Edwards and I talked about earlier this year. Oh my God, last year, Jesus Lord. Just curious about, like, how can we be intentional about creating employment opportunities for folks who are more connected to the community, right? Because that's also an issue, that we have a lot of officers that don't live in the city of Boston. And that there are ways for us to think creatively about how we can create opportunities or even a pipeline, right? For folks, and just curious about what that looks like. I do have some other questions, but my internet is choppy and my daughter is giving me the face, so I'll be right back. I can hear you though.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I strongly agree. I don't think it's crunchy granola. I think it's critical, right? As we think about the city recovering in an equitable way, and we think about real workforce development, and having good jobs for Boston residents. I think there's a real opportunity here. We're talking all the time about opportunities in our construction workforce. This is a chance for people to get proximate to construction sites, to earn a good wage. Like I said, to take a workplace, safety training course. And I just want to underscore, I mean, even let's say that there's about 100,000 hours that are going unclaimed by the police department right now. I mean, those are hours that could really be worked by our local residents. So I think there's a huge opportunity here. So thanks, Councilor Mejia. And then Councilor Braden.
To that point, I feel the other area that was brought up, mentioned in a previous conversation, was the use of crossing guards who are already on police department payroll, and if they could be utilized to address this unclaimed construction details. It might be a way to pilot, a transitional approach to the detail work, and see if we could utilize folks who are already on the payroll.
Great, thank you, Councilor Braden. Councilor Arroyo?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, in terms of civilian details, I think another positive of that is that it allows our officers some time. Yeah, I mean, when we talk about forced overtimes, which has come up in the past, when we talk about just how strenuous their day-to-day work is, to then also be putting squarely on their shoulders that they're exclusively doing details, I think we're creating this weird double world where we have them, I think quite validly, speak about not being able to see their families, not being able to attend their children's sporting events, things that I believe all people should be able to really do, even though not everybody has that ability. And so when we're talking about that, when we talk about forced overtimes and OT, to then try to square that away with why we should exclusively keep details in their realm, and we should have this ability for hours and hours and hours and hours of detail work on top of their regularly scheduled work. I just don't know why that would be a negative, to take away something from their plate when they have so much on it. So I just think there's an additional, beyond just, creating a civilian workforce and creating new jobs. I do think there's a mental health, there's a amount of hours worked in keeping that in a healthy realm for officers that I think is worth approaching this on as well.
Great, thank you, Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Mejia, were you looking to add something?
No, I actually wanted to go back to the comment around the civilian, creating opportunities for folks to have competitive wages, and I think that is also should be a part of the conversation in terms of what that would look like. And I think it was Councilor Breeden had talked about some of the administrative jobs that are being done right now through the police department that could potentially be also given to regular civilians. And I'm curious a little bit more about what that could look like and what are some of the barriers to making that happen.
Yeah, so I think that was I think Liz, did you mention those? I mentioned those, but I'm not sure.
I think it wasn't me.
Yeah.
It wasn't me, Madam Chair.
So I think it was me. No, I'm just making, yeah. So basically, no, I wanted to make sure I hadn't missed Councilor Brady and say something about them. So yeah, I think a number of these, so there's a bunch of desk roles in dispatch and detail assignment, other things that are assigned to sworn officers by the contract that I think are not, it's not clear that that it's the best use of kind of those extra skills that police officers bring to their work. And so from the city's perspective and a sort of cost management perspective, like when we're paying for a sworn officer, I think it's important to have them doing police work. And so, like I said, it was the department referenced in July of last year, kind of a long-term goal of about 80 to 100 of those. Some of them are called out in the contract currently, some aren't. But there's a substantial number of them, Councilor Mejia, that in terms of barriers, we would have to, that would be a contract negotiation point where it actually, because sometimes in the contract, it actually says like, there will be this number of detail officers like in each of the units or whatever. So we'd actually have to change that. And then in some places it's just a practice, and it could, it's something that there could be a management shift on without necessarily a contract change. So it depends.
Are we seeing this memo as a living document? Like,
yes.
Are there any other reforms that we as a council, are thinking of proposing? And will we have the opportunity to update this document to reflect those proposed changes as we continue to evolve the dialogue? Are we seeing this as something that will continue to change as the times change?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything has to. I think the goal certainly for me as a committee chair is for us to get to something that enough of us can kind of agree on as a statement of principles to put it out there and have it help set those expectations at the bargaining table. Because like Pam said, we and frankly, legislative bodies across the state have gotten into a situation where people expect that at the end of the day, we'll just approve those joint labor management committee awards, which, as I said last time, was really financially very difficult for the city, and I would expect to be so again. So I think we're trying to shift the whole expectation. And I think the part of the way to shift that whole expectation is to reach some kind of like basic values and policy related reforms that the council wants to see in upcoming contracts. I think, in order to kind of put that out on the table, we have to reach somewhere static, but it's only static for a period of time, right? I mean, we can always add things into the conversation. Who's at the table shifts. But the whole point of having this working session and this conversation, and the reason I pulled together the memo in the first place is that it was really a way of summing up a lot of the conversations we'd been having and then trying to have the next iteration. So I'd say if there's anything that people want to add, we should throw it into the mix now or later. So. Anything else on civilianization before going to the last topic?
I had just a quick comment. If we start from the premise that what we're doing is unsustainable, which it isn't sustainable, I wonder if the police department has ever done like a systematic review of all their grades and really looked at like which positions could be civilianized or and what sort of support those civilians would need in terms of supervision or whatever. Because unless we are partnered with the police department in this conversation and making a concerted effort to actually do something at the end of the day, then we're going to be in the same place next year. And it'd be really nice to think that we are working in partnership with the police department to try and achieve cost savings that will impact the bottom line at the end of the day, and yet respecting the special skills that police officers, the sworn officers, do have, and then recognizing the contributions that civilians. So I think it off, but I think it only can only if we work in part.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Braden. No, I think that having a department that is committed to the fiscal responsibility and reform. And frankly, I mean, mayoral leadership in that category is just going to be extremely important for really making progress on this front. And I want to underscore that in some ways what that's about is asking, I think in a funny way, part of what this exercise is about is asking the department to think a little bit more like we have to think as a council. And what I mean by that is, it's one thing when you're just saying, oh, well, give me another dollar and I can find a way to spend it on policing, right? But when what you actually are sitting with is, a limit, the total number of tax dollars of the city, and you're trying to think about, okay, how do I make this a better city? Well, I've got to ensure public safety, and I've also got to ensure public education, and I've also got to get this street paved, and one of the first things you think is you don't want to give up any of those priorities. So you immediately start wondering, how do we do this smarter, right? How do we do this better? How do we make sure that all of these goals can be met with our current resources? And I think that's how we're tasked of thinking about the budget. That's how a mayor is tasked with thinking about the budget. And in some ways, it's all natural for our departments to each of them think about their mission and how they do as much as they can. And of course, they want as many resources as they can. The challenge we have is that because of the way that this rule has been implemented, the two departments that we don't ask to think that way are police and fire. In the sense that there is kind of an ability to draw infinite resources. And I think not always a squaring up about our need to absolutely prioritize public safety, but do it in a way that's really stewarding every dollar as though there was a critical need for it because there is. So I think you're totally right, Councilor Braden, that it's got to be a partnership with the department on that front. There's no other real way forward. And I think this conversation is about identifying some of those issues, but that would help, but you need a department's partnership. So Councilor Campbell, I see you got your hand raised.
I agree with you and appreciate Councilor Braden's point. I think I appreciate the work and the exercise to put on paper some of what we're discussing offline or with residents, and to make it succinct and to present it to the administration department to make it easier for them to partner with us. But if you do not have a department or leadership that is open to these types of discussions and trying different things, it is going to be very difficult, extremely difficult to see the reforms that we would want to see the transparency that we would want to see, to get the accountability that we would want to get. I've had really great experiences with previous leadership in the police department. Even I always lift up body cameras because that was one issue that was, when I first came to the council, the city, through the work of tremendous advocates, had agreed to do a pilot program. It took a long time for the city to agree to that, but then the question was, well, how are we going to implement that? And as a chair of public safety, worked with the department at the time. It was Commissioner Evans, it was different leadership at the time. And there were a lot of folks in leadership that were not for body cameras, but agreed to participate in a series of meetings in different neighborhoods to have a conversation, not only with the advocates, but residents about body cameras. And through these series of conversations, folks in the department started shifting their stance on body cameras. And what allowed, not only implementation of a policy, but also development of documents to bring into the collective bargaining space. Commissioner Evans and others brought letters and different ideas as to what the policy should include into that space. And when we came out on the other side, advocates agreed that actually the plan governing the pilot program was a good one. And that maybe they got, I think it was over 80% of what they asked for, which is huge. Given that usually if we ask for things, you're lucky if you get 50%, 80% or something. It was a very high number. And that was only because you had a department that was willing to bring in these ideas, entertain them, and also be flexible in their thinking. If we don't have that, it is going to be very difficult. And I think we're seeing that right now, not just on the overtime conversations or other pieces of legislation, but also on the commitments the city agreed to implement those things. If you don't have leadership and those in leadership at the department who are open-minded and wanting to see some of these changes. It's going to be very difficult. So I just wanted to lift that point up. I appreciate the exercise because I think it would be easier to give them specifics. But we've done that and it still is challenging. So obviously there's some leadership changes going on, questions about leadership right now in the department, which of course is making it a lot more difficult to do some of this. But I think it's a question we all need to reflect and think about, and to just really lift up for the public in particular, who I think also remains frustrated with the how long it takes to get things done and to move some of these things forward, or to get the type of transparency we would like to see from the department.
Thanks so much, Councillor Campbell. I think I want to move to the last set of topics, and then I'll ask colleagues for comments on those and any final comments too. So this is really about transparency to enhance and ensure public trust. And actually, Councillor Campbell was just talking about body cameras, and one of the things that's come up repeatedly is the desire to, extend body cameras to all BPD units and require them to be worn during overtime hours. That was something that was in the Boston Police Boston Police Reform Task Force report. And I think, there's an expectation on the council side that expansion will be achieved. It's not clear if it needs contract change or it could be done through department policy, but I think either way, that's, we've heard a lot of people say, look, as we know, we talked about, we've got a lot of officers doing overtime, replacement overtime, which means they're covering someone else's shift. So from the member of the public's perspective, it's completely contingent whether the officer who you're interacting with is on overtime or on regular hours, and they should have a body camera on in either case. And then another couple of things in this transparency category is, sharing information that's provided to the unions with the public as well. And this, again, I don't think is really a bargaining thing, but there are a bunch of places where our police contracts require that information like work schedule, shift vacancies, available overtime or detail shifts, seniority lists, orders, et cetera, be publicly posted on department bulletin boards or otherwise shared. And I think those things should be publicly posted and shared with the public as well. And frankly, that would help. It would make it easier, given the lack of clarity about minimum staffing levels, to understand how staffing is distributed across the department, and it would help the council to understand where that distribution is dictated by the contracts or by sort of the discretion of the commissioner and the command staff. And then another, a third thing is just to make sure that the contract language doesn't impede the sharing of important use of force and sensitive officer conduct accountability data with the public. So again, this is really about enforcing the ideas of the task force. The task force's recommendations 4 and 5 focused on public facing data dashboards about use of force, FIOs, complaints, search warrants, et cetera, to be disaggregated by various categories like race, ethnicity, and zip code. And so, you'd want to make sure that our contracts allowed for sharing of the data in that way in order to enhance public confidence in policing. And I think that's the overall thing, is that what's tough about these conversations, and it's true for all city departments, is that there's a necessary relationship of mutual interdependence and trust between the public, the departments, and the elected officials, right? The public elects us to hold the departments accountable. We rely on the departments to do their work. The public relies on them, but often they can't do their work without the public trust. Nowhere is that more true than in policing. And a lot of this work to kind of, bring the way that the contracts have policy implications out into the sunlight and talk about it, is to help build that kind of public trust in the system that we have, and not have it feel like there's invisible reasons why we can't police in the way that's sort of smartest and most responsible for our community. So any comments on this category, on the transparency front, that anyone wanted to raise? I know, again, that we've talked about some of this before.
Yes.
Oh, Councillor Mejia, yes.
Yes. No, I really do appreciate the the accountability piece, I think, because that's the best way for us to hold ourselves accountable to the process. But I think hold ourselves accountable to the people just as equally as important is making sure that we're sharing information and that there is a dashboard. I always say I'm the dashboard queen because I want, like Elizabeth Warren, there's a plan for everything. I want a dashboard for everything, right? Like that we can do some checks and balances, that there's a way for us to look at how much money we're spending at overtime, that we're doing this in a way that we can help support making data informed decisions, right? In terms of just saying, we're gonna do X, Y, and Z. Well, let's look at the data. Let's, is this the right move? I think that this accountability and transparency piece is the most critical piece of this whole conversation. Is like, how do we, what systems are we going to put in place to ensure that we are able to address this once and for all? I feel like we keep having the same conversation, and it feels like we've been at this for a year now, Councillor Bach, and I'm hoping that that those who are tuning in, particularly our police officers, know that this is, like Councillor Breeden said, is that we need to do this in partnership, and so that it doesn't feel like we're doing this to them, but that we're doing this with them. And I think that that is really important. And then maybe figuring out a way for them to also participate in just providing some input. I know that you said earlier that there couldn't be that because of the way the situation works, but there must be a mechanism in place for us to hear, from them. So I'm just curious about what that accountability would look like for them as well, how they plan to hold themselves accountable to this.
Yeah. So, and I think on that, I mean, it's important. I'll just repeat this because it's a good question and it came up earlier, is like we, the council, can't have a back and forth two-way conversation with the police unions about the contracts. And that's because there's a charter provision that says that the council needs to not negotiate contracts on behalf of the city. And so when we're talking about these contract provisions, in order to make sure that we stay in the kind of realm of policy conversation and not get into some kind of real-time negotiation, that's why we can't have the unions on the line here. Nothing about that prevents our police officers from sending written testimony, from testifying, in their personal capacities. Just, it can't be a back and forth with the council. But I also want to stress that, to your point, Councillor Mejia, about the role of the officers and officer leadership, I think it's important to underscore that, like, of course, there's a negotiation, right, that happens between our bargaining units, our police bargaining units, and the administration. And, to borrow something that you often say, right, I think part of the goal here with this policy accountability is to call everyone, both the police officers and the administration, not to call them out, but to call them in, right? And the weird thing is that we can't convene that conversation between all the parties because of this rule about us not negotiating the contracts. But what we can do is, in this space, talk about, these are the expectations that we're trying to set because of what we're hearing from the people we represent, right? And then we're asking them all to bring those into the conversation and to bargain in good faith, not to reach impasse and go to your corner and hope that you can get the best thing out of the arbitration committee, but to say instead, like, hey, how do we together reach agreement on responsible policing in the city, and contract changes that can work for policy reform. I mean, to me, that is part of the purpose. So that's something I hope for in these conversations. Other questions, comments? I also, Pam, if you wanted to say anything else, we're going to wrap up in a minute, but I just want to give anybody an opportunity. Okay. Well, I really want to thank everybody for coming and joining us for these 2 hours. This is, it's, like Councillor Edwards said, hashing out views about contract revisions is not the sexy part of counciloring. but it is, I think, really important in the weeds policy work on an issue that that people in the city care so much about, and that has so many dimensions related to keeping folks feeling safe and feeling respected and trusting their government, right? And there is nothing more serious that the government does than to wield the use of force. That's why there is this heightened need for public policy scrutiny and attention to anything having to do with policing, because there's lots of realms in which we write tickets, right? Like, oh, you shouldn't have left your trash out the wrong day, et cetera. But once we're in the world of policing, it can have these really permanent effects on people's lives. And we have to, hold ourselves to the highest standard in the whole way that we govern that. So definitely my staff and the committee staff will be kind of collecting everybody's comments from today and sort of working on an updated version of this document. But I'm really grateful for everyone's engagement. And I do want to give Councillor Campbell, my co-sponsor, and Councillor Edwards, if she'd like, and any of the other councillors, an opportunity just to make any closing statement if you'd like. So Councillor Campbell.
No, just thank you. Look forward to continuing the work. Stay safe and healthy. Bye, everyone.
Great, thanks. Anyone else looking for raised hands? Okay, great. All right, well, in that case, I'm going to adjourn this working session of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee. Thank you all.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everybody.